Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel on Between Worlds, Jewish, Latin, and Arab Identities and Conversation. My name is Estelle Tarica. I'm a professor of Latin American literature and Jewish studies at UC Berkeley, and I'm joined today by our two featured artists and authors, Sonia Daccarett and Emily Cohen Ibañez. There are so many facets to Jewish identity in the world, and Latin American Jewish experiences within that often go unseen. So today we have a really wonderful opportunity to explore these elements of Jewish identity. And we're here with two Bay Area Jewish women with connections to Colombia. Sonia Daccarett, who is the author of the 2025 memoir, Roots of the Guava Tree, about growing up Jewish and Arab in Colombia, and Emily Cohen Ibañez, who's a documentary filmmaker who's made films on Colombia and California, and is at work on a new film that she'll discuss with us today. And we're going to start by just having our two guests talk about where you come from and about your Jewish identity and background. So Sonia, why don't you get us started?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Estelle. And thanks, Emily. It's been such a joy getting to know you in preparation for this panel. Thank you to the Magnes for bringing us together, and to Jutina, an organization near and dear for my heart. It's can you hear me? No. Oh, Jutina, sorry, enthusiasm. Celebrating Latin American Jewish life wherever it happens to be taking place. As Estelle said, I'm the author of a memoir about growing up with a Christian Arab father and a Jewish mother in Cali, Colombia during the drug war 80s. I started thinking about my identity very deeply a few years ago when I realized that I was living a very happy, very fulfilling life here in the Bay Area that seemed to have very little to do with the way that I grew up and my childhood story. So I started writing to try to reconcile both aspects of my identity, including sort of the before and the after. And I realized that it's very common for immigrants to have a before and an after story. The place that they grew up is the first story, and then the life that they chose and what happened to them after they left their country is the second part of the story. But I really wanted to write about the first part so that I could braid it together more closely with my current life. In the writing that then became a book, I didn't set out to write a book, but it then became a book, I realized that the common themes for me were identity, family, and diaspora. And I grew up wondering about the rich backgrounds of my grandparents and parents, and all it meant to me and to them in the context of also growing up as Colombian, and a place where, I was brought up without a religion, so in Colombia, Catholicism is very connected to national identity, so kind of wondering how that also impacted my life and what it meant to me. A little background about my family very quickly. In the book, I talk about my parents and grandparents extensively. My parents were both born in Colombia. My grandparents were the immigrants. My Arab grandparents came to Colombia in the 1910s, 1915s or so, from what was then the Ottoman Empire. They Christian Arabs, along with Jews from the Levant in that period, emigrated to Colombia in some fairly large numbers, and to Latin America, and made new lives there. My Jewish grandparents came from what is now Ukraine, but when I was growing up, it was a host of other names that changed with every telling. They came from Bessarabia, they came from Bukovina, they came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I actually, until I wrote this book, never fully actually sat down to figure out where it was that they came from. My parents met in Bogota in the 1960s. They met because my father was a textile engineer, and in Colombia, the textile industry was started by, run by, managed by Jews. There are Jews and Arabs. There was a lot of overlap. My father had a lot of connections and friends and colleagues who were Jewish, and he met my mother at a party, and they fell in love, and they broke the rules. They married outside their own tribes, which at the time was, you know, pretty unusual and transgressive. I will say that my grandparents were, for that generation, about as tolerant as they could be. My Arab grandfather had many Jewish friends, particularly from Arab countries. In those days, Jews and Arabs were considered each other's sort of compatriots in many aspects of life and commerce. They all spoke Arabic. They all came from the same part of the world, and there were some very tight relationships. My father, in fact, has a Hebrew name that I discuss in the book. He's named after a Jewish friend of my Arab grandfather's. But my parents, despite these incredibly rich stories, sort of were first generation Colombians. And I, until I wrote the book, didn't really think about what that meant for them, which was to distance themselves a little bit from the old countries and the languages and the sort of tribal affiliations and look for the future and think about the future for themselves and their family. And what brought them together was really not their differences, but the values that they shared, the importance of education, of family, of hard work and decency. And until I wrote the book, I didn't sort of appreciate the utopian project that they embarked on when they raised my sister and I, which was an Arab and a Jew getting married, moving to different cities that had nothing to do with their families, building a house from the ground up in a remote suburb of Cali, and it would all be fine and have a family with no labels, no religion, no anything. It was just a very blank slate, very utopian in many ways, and I just grew up wanting to know all about the past, why my grandparents spoke Yiddish, why my grandparents spoke Arabic. And so in a reading that I'll do in a little bit, I'll talk about that and about identity. I just really quickly want to say that the book also covers parts of contemporary Colombian history. I grew up in a time where the drug cartels grew to challenge the Colombian state, along with insurgent left-wing guerrillas, particularly in the city where I grew up in Cali. There was a very powerful drug cartel during those times, and so the book is about just an ordinary family living through a very challenging time in Colombian history. And finally, in terms of identity, I've chosen to live a committed Jewish life as an adult, but I'm very interested and fascinated by my Arab grandparents' identities as Ottoman Jews and as Christian Arabs from that era. And I just want to wrap up and say that I think the Arab and the Jewish experience is so diverse and so global, and there are so many migratory patterns that are rarely explored in sort of the mainstream narratives about what it means to be Jewish. And in this age of polarization, I just, through the book and through being here to talk to all of you, it's great to share different stories that might maybe expand the narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, and we'll have a chance to delve a little bit deeper into some of these issues. But let's hear from Emily about your Jewish identity and facets of your experience, background.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to thank Magnes, Reboot, Jutina, and for putting us together, Estelle and Sonia. It's been just such a pleasure to get to know your work, and also I feel like a burgeoning friendship. It's so my family background. My parents migrated from Colombia to the U.S. in 1971, and my father's family, they're originally from Aleppo, Syria, so Syrian Jews. That's the Cohen side, and it was the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and many Jews were leaving. Syria and those areas. So he left at 7. My grandfather left when he was 17, and at that time Greece granted Jews refugee status, and then traveled. He lived for a while in France, and then he and his brother, they heard that in Cuba, it was a good life. And so they got on a boat and they went to Cuba. Apparently my grandfather's brother died there, so he's buried in Havana. And my grandfather, we didn't know till very recently he had a child in Cuba who found our family when he was 80, and we all kind of got reunited. Mm-hmm. But so that all of a sudden I have like Cuban family. I didn't know. But he sold the Panama hat down the canal, and he met another older man, an Aleppan Jew, and who had a daughter in Barranquilla, Colombia. And so they said it was sort of arranged marriage. They're Orthodox family, and he came and married my grandmother, and they, started out in Barranquilla, but then moved to Medellin, which is the interior. Barranquilla is like a Caribbean coastal city. There's a lot of Jewish and Arab culture there. But then they moved to Medellin, and that's where my father was born and raised. And then on my mom's side, they're Catholic Colombians from many generations of the Caribbean coast and still live there. So the Cohen side, everyone has left Colombia, and on the Ibañez side, pretty much everybody is on the Caribbean coast, like, all within the same radius blocks of each other, and a very, very big family. So that's sort of the background I came with, and similar to Sonia's family, my parents were, leftists, and they had both left their religion and wanted, raised us as atheists, and there's a lot of strong feelings about religion and its constraints. But in many ways, now I have maybe a less strict a reaction to whether it's Catholicism or Judaism or any religious framing of life. But I'm grateful for my for my parents that went through that. I think it's liberating now that I've been able, I don't identify as religious, but definitely being involved in the Jewish community, and just being able to take things that I learn culturally from Jewish traditions, as well as, the Catholic family. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'm making a film called Orquídea, which is orchid, and it's about the political and economic life of orchids in Colombia. So it takes place in the Colombian Amazon and through the Andean region, and I'm following orchids, and through that have been connected, I find connections with unlikely eco-conservationists, from ex-combatants of the FARC, which is a leftist guerrilla group, indigenous communities, farmers, and biologists. So and I'm starting, in my work, I really don't, even though I've done other work prior in Colombia, I haven't looked at my own identity, and I'm exploring that now as a character within the film. So.
Thank you, Emily. And we'll get a chance to see a clip. We'll get a chance to see a clip from Emily's film in a few moments. So, Sonia, let's come back to you, and we'd love to get a chance to hear from Roots of the Guava Tree. So, set us up for your reading.
All right, so I thought I would do a very short reading from the book, starting with the prologue of the book. The book begins and ends in the same way, so there's no, I'm not gonna ruin the plot for anyone. It starts and ends as I'm leaving Colombia to come to college in the United States. So the prologue, I'm gonna read a little bit from it. I'm 18, I'm leaving the next day, and my parents have recently moved from the house that I grew up in to a new apartment. The air was warm against my skin. Nostalgic, I sprung my dogs from their new designated sleeping spaces in the kitchen. They wandered around behind me, blinking sleepily. My heart broke as I touched their fur, their tails, their expectant heads. I walked out on the moonlit terrace and sat at the white tulip table, bereft in this new place instead of under the big mango tree in the old house. The night air touched my bare arms and shoulders with a warm embrace. I looked down at the leafy guayacan trees that lined the street below and allowed myself the sting of tears in the back of my eye sockets, but nothing more. I tried to hold back time, suspended between the twinkling lights of the mountains of Cali, the memories and the safety of my parents' love, There was no turning back. My bags were packed and stationed by the front door. I had nearly tripped on the 2 new enormous suitcases already. What is in those suitcases? My father had asked, disapproving. All the things I need, I guess, I answered, shrugging. I had no idea what I needed, except to leave the confusion, the sadness, the unsaid things, the love, the Yiddish, the Arabic, the Spanish, the dead friends, the live ones, the terror of bombings and kidnappings, the immigrant grandparents who arrived in Colombia from across the world, their stories and their silences, the horror of poverty, the guilt of privilege, the thrill of a Cali sky at dusk, the warmth, the dizzying memories. Leave it all behind. Now I'll read a little bit from the introduction, which is a conversation that I have with my father. Probably I'm age 8, and I used to love to really come into my father's office at exactly the wrong time when he really just wanted to read the newspaper or do something, not talk to me, and ask him very difficult questions. So this is a sample conversation. The voice asking the questions is mine, and the voice answering the questions is my father. Why do my sister and I not have a religion? Because you can decide when you grow up. But how do I decide? See if religion makes sense to you. Why do my grandparents speak Yiddish? Because they came from Russia. Do all people in Russia speak Yiddish? Of course not. They speak Russian. So why do my grandparents speak Yiddish? Because they are Jewish. Do all Jews speak Yiddish? Only Jews from certain parts of Europe. What do the other ones speak? Why don't you go play? Why do my other grandparents speak Arabic? Because they came from Bethlehem. Isn't that where Jesus is from? That's what they say. So did Jesus speak Arabic? Don't ask these questions in public. But we're not in public. No lo hagas. Why can't I ask these questions? Because people get upset about religion. But I was only asking about languages. Silence. Why don't we have normal Colombian names? Your grandparents came from different places and their names are our names. But we are not like other Colombians. We're not that different. But we're not Catholic. I guess that's true. So then, what are we? We are nothing. But I knew we were so much more.
Thanks, Sonia. So tell us, why did you want to start this book with this conversation with your father?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said before, this is a sort of, it encapsulates all the greatest hits of all the complicated questions I like to ask my father. I think when I sat down to write the book, or to write down the memories of my childhood, in many ways it was to answer these exact questions. So until I wrote the book, I really didn't consider what it was like for my parents as adults, making the decisions they made. I did not consider what it felt like for my grandparents to be immigrants. I did research into tapes and recordings of my grandparents, and it was amazing to me to hear my grandparents with their Yiddish accents talking about how they landed in Barranquilla. I mean, I'd never thought, what is it like for somebody from Ukraine in the 1930s, from a little Jewish shtetl, landing in Barranquilla, Colombia, where the heat is just overwhelming, the humidity is insane, and seeing tropical fruits for the first time, and the incredible racial diversity that is the Colombian people that they have I'm sure never seen, and must have felt like landing on Mars. And then it wasn't just a trip, it was just their new life. So it was really, by asking all of these questions again as a middle-aged adult of myself and interrogating what it was to felt like, was what led to the book and how it unfolded.
Thank you. For those of you who are looking forward to reading the book, this is really a great introduction to what comes next. So I highly recommend continuing on from this introduction. So let's turn now to Emily and your film. She's going to speak about the film and show us a clip from the documentary, Orquídea. It's currently in progress, so go ahead and get us started on that.
Yeah, so it is a work in progress. So we're still, I'm figuring out how I'm going to incorporate these questions of identity, and you'll see a little bit. So it's sort of a work in progress sizzle. It's just a 5-minute clip that kind of gives an overview of the way that I'm exploring the tone and my own narration through the story. And so I think I can just show the clip. I kind of introduced, I'm following orchids in a place in Colombia. It's the national flower, as well as you find the most biodiversity of orchids in the world in Colombia. So great. I'll show the clip.
Cuando nací, no tenía nombre. En mi tercer día de vida, mis padres me pusieron el nombre Emily. Inmigrantes recientes de Colombia a Estados Unidos pensaron que un nombre inglés me ayudaría a pertenecer. El nombre orquídea proviene de una antigua palabra griega, orquis o testículo. La orquídea es también la flor nacional de Colombia. Colombia, un país con 2 océanos, cumbres andinas y selva amazónica. Contiene una semilla de rebelión contra las fuerzas autoritarias que buscan explotar sus ricos recursos naturales. Tierra con la mayor biodiversidad de orquídeas del planeta, llega una historia sobre la supervivencia humana y sueños de una patria que aún no existe. Sígueme a un laberinto mítico de flores donde me encuentro con una insólita alianza de soñadores, protegiendo los árboles donde crecen las orquídeas. Desde 2016, los proyectos extractivos han deforestado el 40% de la Amazonía colombiana. Las orquídeas colombianas crecen en las ramas de los árboles. Cuando se talan los árboles, las orquídeas mueren.
Uy, las orquídeas son muy inteligentes. La evolución ha hecho que sean la familia con mayor evolución en el grupo de las plantas.
El sistema de raíces rizomáticas de las orquídeas son portales hacia un inframundo laberíntico. Nos recuerdan que debemos soñar con un futuro mejor en tiempos difíciles.
Como era rara la vez que uno iba como con tranquilidad por un monte de eso. Entonces hasta ahora es que uno le ve esa belleza y eso. Mi sueño es hacer como un museo de la orquídea. Ponerla como una forma de laberinto.
La mamita lo añora mucho, ¿no? Le da mucha nostalgia de ver que todavía le queda un pedacito de tierra para ella y pues ella siempre dice, darame viendo mi monte, mi tierra.
Las flores se secaron en el otro año pasado, solo chamizas, solo chamizas. Vinieron esas gentes de lejos y desde que fueron y decir que esta tierra no es de usted, decir que esta tierra era del gobierno. Y yo le dije, esa tierra esto es un territorio de los indios, que fueron con armas, todos echándole tiros.
Quienes cuidan los espíritus de las flores resisten el borrador de la historia. Quienes olvidan caen en el abismo.
Pecadores, ahora y en la hora de nuestra muerte. Amén.
Ya uno escucha de que nuevamente se levantan dos grupos, entonces todo va a volver a ser como solamente guerra.
Amén. Y un día Maye me llama y me dice, mami, vea, esta mata te va a florecer. Le dije yo, ¿por qué si estés muriendo? Dijo, no, es que ya se le caen las hojas para echar la florescencia.
Cuando las hojas muertas del laberinto histórico de Colombia se descomponen, ¿qué nuevas posibilidades florecen?
Emily, thanks for sharing that clip. Probably not the only one in the room who can't wait to see the film. This is not your first film. You have a long career as a documentary filmmaker. Some of your earlier films have touched on really different kinds of topics, including a film about landmine injuries in Colombia. Orquídea is just a really different kind of documentary project. So tell us about your own process. What led you to this film?
Yeah, so the landmine film, it's called Bodies at War, Mina. And that, I was my first long form doc, and I was making that in my 20s. And so I was doing my doctoral degree in anthropology, and my work was looking at what it means to be injured, or when your status as a full human person is put at risk. So that project, I was working with soldiers, as well as civilians who had been injured by landmines. And, soldiers had access to the best care, obviously, with massive injury, where civilians didn't. And so a lot of it was looking at also the prosthetic industry that was growing up all around this conflict, and it was like a booming industry, and then kind of dreams that people had for their bodies and ideas around body image. So this idea of person has been with me, and I've been fascinated even in our country, the history of the United States, where slaves or women were considered historically less than full human persons legally, but a corporation is considered a full person. When I was making the landmine project, this was in a time of authoritarianism in Colombia, and it was a difficult time, and it was preceded the peace treaty. And then the film Bodies at War was used in Havana was shown as part of the peace talks. I did that work for over a decade, and worked very closely with the Colombian campaign against landmines. And then the peace treaty happened in 2016. I had turned my attention to really doing work in the United States, both with veterans of war here, as well as I have a film with the farm workers, focusing on labor and women. But I was inspired by, one, I was troubled that after the peace treaty, ironically, you get mass deforestation of the Colombian Amazon. So because the leftist guerrillas were using guns to protect to hide under the canopy of forest, they were staving off extractionist projects. And when the peace treaty happened, private industries came in and just mass deforestation of the Amazon. But in response, environmental activists in Colombia were able to gain personhood status for certain mountains, rivers, forests, and I found this really fascinating. And so it kind of turned me to what if Orchid were a person, and what if Orchid were the protagonist of this film? and really delved into just following orchid. And I'm really excited. At the end of the summer, I'm working with Earth Law Center, and we're working towards making Orchid Ecosystems a legal person in Colombia, and will become a co-producer of this film. So yeah, there's this sort of questions around personhood that continue. But as a filmmaker, I've really developed my craft, and taking from fiction, elements of fiction. So I'm working with set designers, and we're going to be integrating elements of set design in the forest to create this labyrinth. So that's why I talk about the labyrinth in the clip. And it's going to be this container for the story in which we're moving through this labyrinth. And then I'm working, co-creating a script with the participants in the film, and we're working towards creating these dreams that using the art of cinema, we can create these sort of dreams. So it really is this hybrid film between fiction and nonfiction, of hybrid identities and looking at diversity. And yeah, I think that's where it shares, sort of looking at different narratives around Jewish, Arab, and Latina experience.
Thank you, Emily. That's a little moment of applause. As we were meeting, the three of us, we were just so struck by the convergences between our two panelists' work. And so this is a moment for the compañeras to talk to each other.
Yeah, Sonia, I'm just so compelled. I loved the book. It's such a beautiful book. So if you haven't read it, it's such a treat. And the roots of the guava tree, how did you come to that as the way to frame the book?
Sure. The guava tree became, in the book, I write a lot about the garden in the house where I grew up. My father had this very big gardening dream of turning the garden in that house into some sort of Mediterranean paradise. And unfortunately, the Cali tropical weather never worked because, you know, the tropical heat charred the grape leaves that he was going to use for stuffed grape leaves, and then the Mediterranean fruit trees barely grew, and he was always just so frustrated by these trees that he was trying to plant in the garden, where I just noticed the local trees that predated us on the property, the guava trees, were just insane, overproducers, plopping guavas everywhere, to the point where they would fall in the pool and all over the floor, and they would rot, and my mom would beg people to just take crates of guavas. And to me, they became the symbol of what I longed for my family to be happy, productive, and rooted in place where they found themselves. So that's where the guava tree came into the title.
So beautiful. I love that image. Keep it with me. That's amazing.
Yeah, and so likewise, how did you come to orchids? Because orchids are they're so Colombian. They're such a beautiful, and there's so many varietals. So I'm just curious where the idea for orchids came from.
Yeah, well, partly being the national flower, the Cattleya orchid, but also Colombian orchids, 80% of Colombian orchids, they're epiphytes, so they grow in tree branches. They don't grow from the soil. And they are incredible reproducers and evolve at such a rapid rate that they create species all the time. So there's this incredibly biodiverse flowering plant, the oldest of the flowering plants on the planet. So I saw them as sort of these all-knowers of history, a way to explore Colombia as a place, as a landscape, kind of creating this social cultural kind of map through the orchid, and also the elements of sort of this diasporic beings in some ways. You know, they cast millions of seeds through the air, and they have to catch on moss and mycelium to be able to germinate. And they co-evolve with really particular insects. So on one hand, incredibly resilient plants, and on the other hand, so fragile. You know, if their coevolution happens with even one particular insect, well, they'll do biomimicry. So a pollinator can even have aspects that look like the orchid itself, and vice versa. They do this kind of mirroring. if that orchid dies, that pollinator dies. There are such important bioindicators for ecosystems because of this. And orchids, I'm fascinated also by their hermaphrodites. They have male and female. They're kind of these hybrid beings. And so they can survive their pollinator dying, but it really reduces their ability to speciate. So there's even, people call them kind of like the ghosts, you know, they wear the ghosts of the dead pollinator. And eventually, you know, that goes toward, risks their lives, the orchid's life as well. So I think those, you know, the orchid also, and I say a little bit in that clip, the rhizomatic root systems, it's just incredible how the roots grow horizontally along the tree branches and just kind of feed from the air in this amazing way. And really, in La Planada, where I'm filming part of this,
Where is that? What part of Colombia?
Yeah, it's in Nariño. So that's like on the border with Ecuador. And it's a cloud forest at 5,000 feet. So the film, you go through the Amazon River Basin, which is at sea level, but all the way up to a 16,000 foot volcanic peak. So you see really that great, incredible biodiversity of landscapes in Colombia. But in La Planada, it's a cloud forest and actually considered one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And it's just incredible. The trees are just blanketed in moss and just flowers and so much life sprouting out, to the point where the Awa indigenous community who safeguard that land say the Awa actually come from moss. They sprout alongside the orchids. That's their creation story. So those are, you know, some of the things that orchids are just, they have such rich meanings and just properties as their kind of being that makes me curious about them.
So I really appreciate how each of you in your work in different ways, yet also in really convergent ways, are giving us a lot of new language or images for thinking about Jewish community and Jewish belonging and connection and the interplay between a rooted experience and a diaspora experience. So I just really love how we can think alongside you with these guava tree and orchid images. As we close, let me just ask you each one last question. So, Sonia, what's one story from your book that you've been thinking about or that you bring to mind these days?
I think one of the things that I think about a lot is the importance of hybridity and of talking about different stories. I think as Jews, we don't just all come from one place. We don't all speak one language. Jews come from very different places. We come in all kinds of colors, as do Arabs. And I think some of these stories are sometimes flattened or actually completely ignored to make way for sort of a more predominant mainstream narrative that I don't think is serving any of us well these days. So making space for those stories. When I was growing up, I think one of the interesting things, and I wrote the book also about just feeling so different from everybody else around me and feeling like my story was so unusual and there was nobody else like me. And in the process of obviously growing up and becoming an adult, but certainly since writing the book and speaking to readers and people about the book and about the topics in the book, I have grown to really, my favorite part actually has been to speak about readers, about their own personal stories, about their own creative stories, about their stories of their own families, migration, immigration, identities, and how in the end, we all share so much more than what we think we don't. And in the end, we all feel like strangers in one way or the other. It's part of the human experience, and the work is really figuring out how to connect to others and how to not feel like strangers and not feel alone. So that's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who get this book, you'll see an amazing story about a Passover Seder in Bogota that should be anthologized in sort of like classic Passover Seder scenes. And think it really exemplifies some of what you're talking about.
You a fan?
Yeah. And Emily, tell us about one experience from making Orquídea thus far that has really resonated especially for you.
Yeah, it's been one of the most incredible experiences of my life. I've been working on this for the past 4 years. But I guess I can bring the most recent moment. I just came back from Colombia a week ago, and Mama Rosa, who you see the elderly woman walking through her garden, I showed her the sizzle, and we're starting to work on our co-created script for her dream. And when she saw it, she started crying, and she thanked me for listening to the elders, and it was quite emotional, and I think that was really meaningful. Making independent films, like any kind of independent art form, it's a rough road, and there's a lot of, no's, honestly. And so that was a really important moment, and just kind of centered me. And I think what Sonia was saying about that connection, and Mama Rosa, it's so interesting. She says she comes from a line of infidels because they didn't convert to Catholicism. They were kind of the rebel indigenous group. She's Kumbal. And there's just certain elements of her rebellion that I just really love and identify with. And she has this lineage of kind of spirit elders that are these women who were rebellious kind of indigenous chiefs that were resisting colonization. And she won't give up her ancestral land, and regularly armed men come and threaten her. And she's really, and the dream is gonna be all about kind of handing the land to her granddaughter, who's actually an anthropologist as well, an indigenous anthropologist, and she's really wonderful. So, yeah, I think it's those connections. And often I grew up in Arizona, very right-wing kind of environment with these leftist immigrant parents. And I felt really out of place. And I was like, why out of all places did we have to land here? But we did, and and now I'm in the Bay. But I'm late 40s, and I still feel like I'm always in a perpetual identity crisis. I haven't quite reached maturation. But when when this came about, and hearing about Sonia, and oh my gosh, another, someone who's at the intersection of Arab and Jewish identity in Colombia, which, we talked about how you're referred to as turco, and it's almost like a derogatory term, and being Jewish, it's like on one hand in Barranquilla, it's such a rich culture point that's so impactful and influential in the general culture, but then there's also a minority status that there can be discrimination around that as well. So yeah, I think that, oh my gosh, I'm losing track of what you asked me. But it was really that moment with Mama Rosa, and just that sense of belonging and connection, I think, is really probably what I'm after.
So Emily, tell us when we can expect to find Orquídea in theaters, or what kind of festivals it might be showing at.
Well, I have something that's coming up much sooner. So I have a short called River with ex-combatants of the FARC who become competitive river rafters in the Colombian Amazon to become champions on the world stage. And it's just a short film. I can't yet say, but it already has a premiere. So it'll be coming out this September. But I still even have to finish that one. I'm waiting to see if I can get some finishing funds. So this is a perpetual thing with filmmakers, is the funding part. But with Orquídea, it's really, it will take a little while longer. So I'm thinking it'll be more like a 2028 premiere. I don't yet know the festivals, but we want to be on the, we're hoping for a pretty big premiere and international distribution. So,
and hopefully there'll be a Bay Area event to celebrate it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Sonia, tell us about where since you've finished the book and have been talking about it and promoting it, tell us what kind of spaces you've been in, what kind of responses you've gotten, and where you're going next with it.
That's a good question. So the responses have been really interesting. I think I've spoken to a lot of Jewish audiences. I've spoken to audiences who are not familiar at all with Colombia. I've spoken, in a lot of different kinds of groups. I do a lot of independent if people choose the book for a book club, I'll come to their book club. Or if people want to run a salon, I'll do that as well. I also do public forums like this. So I've been speaking to people who have never read the book. I assume many of you have not here. I also speak to people who have read the book and have many questions. I would say, I think my favorite, as I said, was the connection with other people's stories. The other part is really just wow, I didn't know that there were Jews in Colombia. Wow, I didn't know that there were Arabs in Colombia. And so just a little contribution to bringing those stories forward has felt very rewarding to me. Where I go next with it, I am not exactly sure. The book came out about 8 months ago. I'm still in the kind of promotion part of the book, but I would like to get down to writing my next book. So we'll see what happens there.
Great, to be continued. So thanks to both of you for this conversation. Sonia's going to be upstairs at the marketplace signing copies of the book. And at the Jutina table, thank you. And Emily will be around to address more questions and interests. So thanks to both of you, and thank you to our audience and to the Magnes for hosting, and the festival, and Jutina for giving us this space.
Thank you.
Thank you.